So our first talk is from my colleague here at Arihanta Institute, my wonderful colleague, Professor Cogen Bohanec. And the title of Dr. Bohanec's talk is Jain Ecotheology and Ecopsychology. Dr. Bohanec, we welcome you to the stage. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Miller, and thank you so much, Diana, for also helping organize this. But of course, especially thank you to Dr. Parveen Jain, whose vision has made all of this possible. I'm really privileged to have heard about Parveen's musings about this institute for over the last decade. And I was so amazed to watch it all unfold so quickly and all of the success that we've had in just a few years. So that's largely due to the vision and the efforts of Dr. Parveen Jain. So thank you, everybody. And also, of course, thank you to the Uberoi Foundation for supporting this. A couple themes that we have in this conference intersect with my talk. During this talk, there's a few things you can reflect on in terms of your own lived experiences. The roles of consumerism is particularly important in the discussions about ecopsychology, how our own psychology can be healed through contemplative practices such as meditation, and also our lifestyle choices and how that affects. And also, if we're talking about human to human compassion, I think an appropriate place to start that conversation is how we relate to ourselves. And the topic of ecopsychology is really emphasizing our own self-healing as being a necessary component to ecological healing. So these are some important points to reflect on that sort of intersect with the themes of this conference. And I'll also note that this talk is based on a paper that is in a book that Dr. Miller and I just sent off to the publisher on engaged Jain studies. So you can see the reference on the bottom of the page there. We're really pleased to see that it's going through its final stages of production now. So everybody keep looking out for that book. So I was just overviewing my CV, the last 20 or so publications, academic publications that I've had, probably about 30 or so, including all of my publications, and probably about 90% of them can be fit under the rubric of ecotheology. So this is really a project that I've been working on for about 10 years or longer, all through my PhD program. And there's a lot of important things, reasons why I kind of moved over to ecotheology from a more standard approach of environmental ethics. I became very disenchanted with the sort of rule-based environmental ethics of deontology and utilitarianism. I dislike the idea of justifying one's behavior. Like, for example, with utilitarianism, one's behavior can be said to be justified if it's operating towards the higher good. Or deontology, if you're treating people the way you want to be treated roughly, then it can be justified. And then also like having a rule that's going to fit universally to all ethical decisions. I have a lot of problem with that. I'd rather not justify behavior. I'd rather say, yes, we make these choices. We do the choice of least evil. We try to figure out how to do that. But that doesn't mean we're necessarily justified in our actions. And I think that's more consistent with karma theory. I also like that ecotheology really focuses on the cultivation and development of identity and culture. And if you've heard me talk on ethics before, you'll notice that, of course, this is both of these things are very much hallmarks of virtue ethics. So I've written and published on virtue ethics a number of times as well, too. But the idea is that we're really going to construct new paradigms that delegitimate the paradigms of oppression and domination that have led to the destruction of the natural world. Now, in the process of studying ecotheology, I read probably 30 books or a lot more on ecotheology, and I was trying to figure out exactly what is the methodology. So I published this paper in 2021 where I proposed that there's kind of a threefold methodology to do an ecotheology. And this is a nice point for those grad students out there who maybe want to do ecotheology. What does it mean to do ecotheology? Well, I would propose that the first thing that you have to do is you have to respond to critique. You have to be open to the fact that all religious traditions can legitimately be critiqued. There's foundations and interpretations of all religious traditions that can be used in service of domination and oppression. So we have to actually say that some of those critiques are there, they're legitimate, but they also can be addressed within the tradition in a way so that the traditions don't become upholding of domination and oppression. Then a second point is what I call theologizing the secular. So there's secular different categories when we talk about environmental thought. There's like a secular category of natural sciences that's going to create technologies that will help the natural world. When we're doing ecotheology from a perspective of a religion, we would see that work of developing that technology as being consistent with religious values. There's secular categories like environmental ethics that aren't necessarily religious, but if we were going to theologize those types of categories, we would see how those otherwise secular categories are consistent with religion, with a particular religion. And in this case, looking at ecopsychology, which is not necessarily a theological discipline at all, but we can see how that can be used in service or in relationship or in dialogue from the perspective of a particular theology. In today's case, this will be from the Jain tradition. And then we have to go look at the traditions themselves and see various different traditional categories and to show how they deal with and how they address ecological issues. So for example, 2,000 years ago, environmental issues were not necessarily as paramount as they are today. So what do teachings like karuna and ahimsa and aparigraha now have to say about our environmental concerns? So we'll reframe traditional categories in a way that they'll discuss environmental concerns. So this is what I'm going to do today with the categories of ecotheology. So keep these loosely in mind because I'll refer back to them throughout this. Now, let's talk about ecopsychology, if that's what ecotheology is. Ecopsychology is kind of the proposition that the destruction of the environmental world really comes from unhealthy psychological tendencies of individuals within societies that then aggregate to unhealthy psychological tendencies of societies at large. So if the destruction of the environmental world is caused by our own unhealthy psychological tendencies, then the corollary would be that if we heal ourselves psychologically, then we can help heal our relationship with the environment, both individually and collectively. So our relationship with the environment is very much part of our own psychological healing. Now, this is a very profound statement, and there's a lot of natural sciences, psychology and everything that are employed to sort of back this up, but also point out that this is entirely consistent with what we find in Jain theology, the idea that healing ourselves can help heal our relationship with the environment. And I'll bring up some points, just some very brief points in this talk that seem to illustrate this. So that implies that there can be a really fruitful dialogue between ecopsychology and the Jain tradition. Okay, so if you were taking notes, you notice that not that you should take notes, but the first methodology of ecotheology is to respond to critiques. Now, it's important to note that the field, the academic discipline of ecotheology really much came after a publication of a paper, which was previously a lecture by Lynn White Jr., where he really critiqued Christianity in particular for providing some of the paradigmatic underpinnings that cause our problematic relationship with the natural world. There's sort of a disconnect between humanity and nature where people, due to their religious beliefs, will see that as justifying using the natural world as merely a resource for a human-centered reality and for dominating the environmental world for human purposes. It's often referred to as the dominion paradigm. And then also religions tend to be otherworldly focused. If all of our value is in the hereafter, it's very hard to value the here, right? If we are just like seeing all of this as just an instrument to getting us to a better afterlife, then we have very little room for valuing this world. And so this sort of otherworldliness can sort of create this disconnection between our ability to care for the environment and that focus on the afterlife. Now, this was levied largely against Christianity because it's a dominant paradigm in the milieu in which Lynn White Jr. was operating, but all of these critiques can also be applied towards the Dharmic traditions. So we should look at the Dharmic traditions and see ways in which Dharmic traditions, Jainism included, can be worldly denying or too otherworldly, and can therefore place the location of value not in this world, but in some other world, and therefore prevent us from having the proper motivation to care for this world. And we can see this often is levied against ascetic traditions, where there's a certain disdain expressed for worldly life. And we've all heard this, samsara is this world is nothing but pain and suffering, and sort of reducing it to its worst common elements. Well, taken in excess, that idea can make it so that you have actually disdain for the natural world. And that's also if these sort of ideas are taken, I would say, out of balance with other ideas within the tradition. So of course, as an eco-theologian, we can acknowledge the legitimacy of those critiques, but we can also say that really these traditions can respond to those critiques. And there's a lot of ways that this can happen. And one thing I like to point at is that Jains are ontological pluralists, which is very different, and they're non-theists, which is very different than the Christianity that Lynn White was critiquing. Now, I will say emphatically that after reading all of these books on eco-theology, Christians have done a wonderful job responding to those critiques. So those are not by any means like knockdown, like decisive critiques that completely makes Christianity bad for the environment. Not at all. Christians have done a wonderful job responding to those critiques from the perspective of Christianity. From the perspective of the Jain tradition, there's not really an external God who's transcendental to this world, who's the source of all value, right? Actually, all living beings that occupy this world have the potential to be divine, liberated beings. And that actually puts the locus of value, it decentralizes it from being a centralized location of power, of value outside of this world, to being actually the location of value is not only with this world, but it's not centralized on one thing like humanity, anthropocentrism, right? It's actually decentralized so that all living beings, and actually everything around us is made up of living beings. So that's where the location of value is. This is a very important way that the Jains can respond to the otherworldliness critique, for example. And then what to speak of all the emphasis of nonviolence and care for the natural world that Parvinji had mentioned in his talk that is throughout. So we see the Ācārāṅga-sūtra, for example, and I can point to any number of sutras, I just to give a sample of how this might work. We can see the sort of injunctions to have compassion to all these different types of living beings who are the locus of value that surround us in every moment in this world, right? And it's important to note that like the Ācārāṅga-sūtra, just to do an interpretive look at it, it really starts with these injunctions. You can see this is really in the first part of the Ācārāṅga-sūtra, which are giving you these injunctions against violence. And it does that way before it starts talking about the ascetic norms of the tradition. It's almost like if we were to say that asceticism is too otherworldly and too world-denying, and there's too much of a disdain for this world, then it needs to be balanced with a lot of prescriptions to be compassionate to this world and to care for this world. And so that balance is really there in the Ācārāṅga-sūtra. It's like, first, know that the locus of value is all the living beings around you. Then we can start talking about asceticism and the problematic natures of the world only after we've properly established the care and the value of this natural world. So that's a really good point that I think is a legitimate reading of the Ācārāṅga-sūtra. So that's just a sample of how we can do a little eco-theology in terms of responding to critique. And now I'm going to talk about the next two methods, theologizing eco-psychology and reframing Jain psychology in service of eco-psychology. Now, I'm not going to individuate between these two methods. They're kind of mixed together here at this point. Okay, so eco-psychology and Jainism. So if we recall, what I said about eco-psychology is the idea that one's relationship to the environment affects one's mental health. What you're surrounded with is going to affect your mental health. Vice versa. Conversely, your mental health is going to affect your relationship to the natural world. It's like a chicken and the egg sort of relationship. Actually, that gets used by a scripture that I'm going to cite in a minute here. So the root causes of ecocide, our destruction of the natural world, comes from our own psychological tendencies, and that we therefore will heal ourselves to heal our relationship with the world. Just as another brief overview, and this is very much consistent with Jain theological beliefs. Now, throughout this talk, I'm going to give you several homework assignments, given that this is Earth Day, or 22nd is Earth Day. I would like to, as a natural professor, I very easily give people homework, even when they're just talking to me in casual conversations. Conversation with a lady yesterday, and I ended up giving her homework. First of all, I lectured, then I gave her homework. Occupational hazard, warning, if you're going to be a professor, you end up doing these things, right? They're not always socially smooth. But I know this isn't a class, but your homework is to go check out Bansky art. Here's an example of that right here, which really does a really wonderful indictment of modern consumerism, etc. So with eco-psychologists, they see consumerism as being linked to psychological maladies, right? And when we look at the media, and we look at advertising and what we see on like TV what we see is this sort of projection of our social and our individual desires, our fears, our aspirations. On the one hand, the media, the marketing industry convinces us that we're lacking and we're inadequate, which is unhealthy psychologically. And that therefore, to become healthy and adequate, we need to buy their product, which is like a double whammy because that also creates an unhealthy expectation. The more you think consumerism is going to heal you, consumer therapy or retail therapy, it's sometimes called, actually the more psychologically vexed you'll become. And another way of looking at this is that when we look at commercials, it's like a diagnostic field for us to look at to see like what's wrong with our society. You know, what are our psychological afflictions? What are the things that we think we need that we're lacking, right? And that's a very profound point that ego psychologists sort of make that relationship between psychological health, consumerism, and desire. Well, the relationship between desire and mental affliction is well established in the Dharma traditions. If you've studied them for 5 minutes, you know this. But we can just see some very small samples coming from the Jain tradition, like the Ācārāṅga-sūtra, or material acquisitiveness gives you sort of a hellish life, right? And you get too aggressive with your enterprises, right? And that aggression itself is not a healthy psychological state. And it'll also create blowback where you upset people and then you get treated in that way as like a karmic consequence, right? And so the consequence of having that materialistic desire causes you to behave in a way that's moha, that's deluded. And one of the ways that I would like to reframe the traditional category is to look at this term moha as being psychological maladies, right? Psychological dis-ease. It often is translated as delusion. But isn't that really what we're feeling when we're not well psychologically? If we are deluded, we don't understand our relationship to things. We have false expectations. We have a narcissistic understanding of self. All these things I'll touch on, right? So all this relationship between your consumerist urges create a sense of delusion. And part of the problem is that no matter what you consume, your desires beyond satiation. So that frustration and that psychological vexation will be there no matter what you consume, because what you get is here today, gone tomorrow. Oh, and by the way, no matter what you get, you just want more. So consumerism can't make us happy. Okay, so here's your homework assignment number 2. This is the wonderful art by Mark Henson. I've put a website there. And you can see this relationship between the first world consumerism on the left and the poverty of poor countries on the right, and how the one leads to the other. This is very much a theme in his artwork, and how we're so flippant about our consumption, and the more we consume in the first world, the more that creates suffering in poor countries because we extract the wealth from those countries. And it's all represented by that one symbol of the American cheeseburger. Because after all, beef is what founded America, right? It was founded on livestock production. It's a central commerce, and it's the main way that we destroy the natural world. So please do, on this Earth Day, go check out the art of Mark Henson. Okay, so now let's talk about another point. We talked about consumerism and desire and how that relates to our own psychological affliction, right? Another thing we can talk about is therefore the corollary to that is that actually we can heal ourselves psychologically by withdrawing ourselves from consumerism, right? Which is what austerity really is, tapas or tapasya, okay? And now your next homework assignment. Please go look at the artwork of Steve Cutts. This is a video, it's about 3 minutes long, called Man. And it's one that I watch frequently, and it makes me lament the status. So, craving and desire creates delusion, which is mental affliction. Mental affliction creates consumerism and desire. They work back and forth with each other, right? As one advances spirituality, one is purifying one's psychology from anxiety and malice and other problematic states. And this is done primarily through austerity and the reduction of consumerist urges. So reducing consumerism is really how we heal ourselves. And this is really a challenge to the sort of psychological toll of modern consumerism. And, you know, this is really something we're going to hear in multiple talks when we talk about the Jain relationship to the environment. The idea of austerity and asceticism is creating a counterbalance to consumerism. It's a very common theme here. So also intersects with our false ideas of self. Eco-psychologists talk about this, how consumerism creates a problematic sense of self, which creates our own problematic psychology and our mental afflictions. And this is a very good meme. I shop, therefore I am. We define ourselves by my, rather than I. We think we are what we have, and the more we have, the grander we will be. Well, this picture very much illustrates it. Please go watch Moby's video, In This Cold Place, also animated by Steve Cutts. So there's this sort of sense of false self, which happens when we create external engagements with consumerism, right? And there's a lot of reasons why this false self and why consumerism leads to this narcissism, which is a false apprehension of what we really are, the way we showcase our wealth and status, the way our wealth and status will give us admiration and envy, right? And this validates our self-importance. And we do this in a way because we feel insecure and empty. And so consumerism, we think, will help us with that, but in fact, it doesn't. So really, consumerist culture encourages us to identify ourselves through our possessions and our external validation. But really, as we feel vulnerable and we feel inadequate, we consume, but that actually doesn't really solve the problem. The more we believe in that, the more we're prevented from actually healing. So we tie our worth to external validation, our material possessions, and this gives us an untenable sort of false sense of self, a narcissistic sense of self, which is part of our mental affliction. And of course, the texts like Dravya Sangraha talk about like our worldly self, or Vyavahara self, as being this sort of delusional self, and how the relationship between the real self, the soul, and the external world creates this bhava karma, this sort of psychological karma, which is very, very profound in terms of trying to understand the basic proposition of eco-psychology, that is the interconnectedness between our environment, ourself, and our psychology, right? So that's very much there in Jain teachings. Okay, so I'll just wrap it up right here to say that there's a lot more that I could say about this, but it's important to create this sort of interdisciplinary approach when we're doing constructive work, eco-psychology, eco-theology, and the Jain traditions. And it's also important that I look deeply at like sort of the ways eco-psychology is very different than the Jain traditions and acknowledge that. I've done some of that in my work as well too. And these are some of the ways that we can derive the ecological benefits of the Jain tradition and teaching Jain values to the world. Okay, so I'll end right there, and thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Cogen Bohanec, for a wonderful presentation of the chapter that you wrote, as you mentioned, for our Engaged Jainism volume, which is currently in production at State University of New York Press. And Cogen is my co-editor on that volume. We can't wait to share it with you. And you got a little taste of the work here. So thank you, Professor Bohanec, for that. There are some questions in the chat. I'm going to start with Dilip Kapasi's question, which I think is an excellent and common question that comes up in the classroom, comes up in philosophical discussions, which is this. What I hear here is taking Jain philosophy and marrying it to the world's current problems, dilemmas, etc. For example, relating Jain philosophy to environment, ecosystems, etc. Perhaps that is fine and dandy, but Jain philosophy is, as I know it, focused on individual soul and its journey to moksha and ultimate liberation. So how do you grapple with that tension? How do you respond to that, Professor Bohanec?
Well, it's hard to say that when there's so much talk about compassion, right? Because compassion isn't focused on an individual soul, is it? I mean, if all of the talk was about compassion to yourself in the Jain tradition, I think that point would be well taken. And this is something that happens a lot, is that like religions get critiqued that you only care about compassion because you're going to get liberation, and that's not real care. But that doesn't really make sense when like your liberation is inextricably connected to your compassionate relationship to the world. It's like, okay, so it's like the subtext is that you shouldn't care about yourself at all, and you should only care about others. Otherwise, it's not real caring. But care is a dialectical thing. It's like it's a dialect. Like care means self, others, this and that. It's between two things, right? Even like self-care is like between your own psychology and the aggregate of yourself. Even that has a reflexive or a reflective nature of it as well too. So I think it's a really good, I love that point because I get that a lot, and I hear this as a critique against religion in general, is that religion can't really do good ethics because there's always self-interest in it. But when your self-interest necessarily involves the interest of others, is it really self-interest?
Great response. Drop the mic there. Wonderful. Yes. And so you gave some homework to all of us. And one of the questions that came up in the previous talk with Parveen Jain that I say for now due to the time was this one. It came up earlier, and maybe you can respond to this briefly. We have about 5 more minutes and we have a couple more questions, but thank you for making this event. What are the effects of veganism versus vegetarianism, with regard to consuming?
Yeah. Every reason that you would have for not eating meat is a reason not to eat dairy. And there may even be more reasons to not eat dairy than to not eat meat. And we can say that if we wanted to be the most compassionate, perhaps starting with quitting eggs and dairy might be the best way to start. There's so many different elements of sexual violation that happens and harm and care to young animals and baby animals that happens in dairy and egg production in a much more intense way than what happens in meat production. Not to say that that doesn't happen in the meat production as well too. And then also the dairy industry and the meat industry are inextricably connected because dairy cows are slaughtered for ground beef. There's so much that has been said on this. And it's really important that if we care about animals, resource consumption is pretty much the same. I mean, feeding a dairy cow and feeding a beef cow is more or less equivalent. So really the short reason is that every reason to not eat meat is exactly the same, if not more, to not eat dairy. I hope that's sufficient answer.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, in our limited time, these sort of cliff note answers are perfect actually for our audience, I think, as well. There's so much more I know you could say around
Oh,
that.
if I could add, that involves any commercial production, even the so-called humane ones, even the so-called ahimsa dairy, even those. I've investigated multiple ahimsa dairies and I found things that are infractions in every single one, no matter even the good intentions of some of the people running those. And also it doesn't really account for a large market share. And there's no way to scale up production for compassionately treated animals, if that's even possible, for products that would create any sort of effect on the economy. So it's very important to realize that the whole humane thing is a hoax, which you can see my wife's work, Cogen Bohanec, on the humane hoax.
Thank you, Cogen G. Well, we do have one more. We have several questions. I'm just going to go to one of our attendees who we haven't heard from yet. I appreciate everyone dropping questions in here because we have about 2 minutes left. From Nisha Mehta Ivy from the Jain Vegan Initiative. I'm so pleased to see Nisha dropping a question here for us. Good to see you, Nisha. It says, Jai Janendra, thank you so much for this talk, Cogen. Very well thought out. What does this reasonably look like for Shravaka lay people when we must live in this world and not completely remove ourselves?
I think this is what I like about the developmental model of virtue ethics a lot, is that we realize that we're flawed and we account for those flaws. And rather than trying to justify those flaws, we're called upon to do better. We can't say, oh, I'm working in the higher good. And, if I have to create some problems, burn some fossil fuels on the way, it's justified because I'm working on the higher good, right? But we don't really get to do that from a virtue ethic model. And I think that, as I said, this is most consistent with karma theory, is that we're still accountable for everything, even if we're doing it for a greater good, even if we don't have a choice, we're still accountable for that. So we're constantly, I call it being vexed. We're constantly, and there can be unhealthy guilt and there can be unhealthy shame when your mind is not balanced with other things, like a good sense of self and other things, confidence and all of these things. If they're not balanced, then shame and guilt can be too much. But at the same time, we shouldn't obliterate our compunction, our sort of feeling of remorse and responsibility for all the things that we do, knowing or unknowing, as we see in the sort of like the prayers, the forgiveness prayers and such. So I think as Jains in the world, as Shravakas, there's this balance that like we have social duties, right? Like if I were to just drop everything and walk away and be a mendicant right now, I'm not entirely sure if that would not create maybe more harm right? Because I have social obligations to certain people, and I'm in a position where that's very hard. We see this with like the life of Srimad Rajchandra, where he elected to stay married, even though he's an incredibly spiritually advanced being. Because it was like, I might actually do more harm if I just drop everything. So we have this sort of calculus that we're doing anyway, but we still have to have that sense of responsibility and compunction that even as Shravakas, as householders, we can still do better, and we have to feel vexed. It's good to reflect at the end of the day of all the things that you've done, not in a way that you're going to create excessive guilt and shame. That's a big problem with Western mindset, but in a way that you actually are going to be encouraging yourself to do better and constantly seeing it as like the hero's journey. Sorry to quote Joseph Campbell, but we're actually we're in a narrative, like we're in a story. We're like a hero in a movie who's trying to overcome the obstacles of this world. And those obstacles are the necessary damage that happens in the wake of our consumptive patterns, right? So it's actually more like an adventure. It's more like something that we should see with enthusiasm and inspiration to try to better ourselves, but not to justify the things that we've done, only to call upon ourselves to do better. So that's just personally how I look at it, if that's helpful.
Well, thank you, Professor Bohanec. We are right on the time to start our next talk. We deeply appreciate this presentation on ecopsychology, and it also reminds me that we do have a course coming out on dairy specifically to the question that you just answered in the Vegan Studies Initiative. So I'll have Diana will drop that in the chat for us here that specifically looks at the effects of dairy to help really unpack that question even further. Thank you so much, Professor Bohanec.